Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and hopefully there's loads of people listening. And if you're not listening at home, then hopefully you're going to catch the recorded video. It's Dan Scarbrough here. I am the publisher at Rockscar. I'm also the Chief Revenue Officer for an innovative company called Stelia. We are live today doing a LinkedIn live talk around sustainable data center future in Sweden, and very excited to be joined by a number of speakers. So the format for today is each presenter is going to do a short presentation, and then we're going to have some questions at the end. If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask during the session, please stick them in the chat and I will endeavor to include them. Joined with me today, we have Stefan Nilsson, who's the Chief Commercial Officer for Conapto. We've also got Lars Schedin, who's the Senior Advisor at EcoDataCenter, Alex Brew, the Regional Director for Northern Europe for Vertiv, and Anna Bloomborg, who's the Manager for Key Customers and the Head of the Data Centers Business Unit for Alfa Laval. Now, obviously, we at the Digital Infra Network are very focused on the transition towards sustainable digital infrastructure and what that means. And as an industry, you know, the increased amount of demand that's been placed on the industry on a kind of hourly basis is making that challenge even harder than it was yesterday. And we're seeing increased amounts of consumption. Everyone seems to be consuming more and more compute. With the advent of AI, you know, there are forecasts that you hear that hyperscale operators' workloads is going to increase by, you know, a significant number, up to a factor of, you know, 7 to 10 based on just AI. So finding a sustainable place for that demand is obviously pretty key. Sweden, as is much of Scandinavia, is at the forefront of the sustainable data center industry and has been involved in promoting green and energy efficient practice in this sector for some time. There are a number of advantages that can be offered for workloads that are based in locations like Sweden in terms of their power infrastructure, renewable energy. So within this talk, the aim is to share insights in Sweden and the advantage of locating your data centers in that particular market. And some of the kind of lessons learned with regard to waste heat recovery and some of the stuff that they've done that hopefully will be a beacon of light for all of the other markets out there and all of the other operators as we go through this transition over the next few years. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Stefan Nilsson is the Chief Commercial Officer for Conapto. Stefan, thanks for joining us today. And Stefan's going to be taking us through more details around Stockholm and, you know, how Stockholm is an option for data center capacity because of its green energy, heat reuse to district heating, and also the connectivity that we've got in Sweden. So I'm going to hand over to Stefan and I will come back before our next speaker. Thank you very much and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Dan. So can you see my presentation? Yeah, you can now. Can anyone shout out and say that I'm visible on the screen?
Yeah, Stefan, you are visible. We can see you, so please feel free to get started.
You can see my presentation.
Yeah, we can see you. Just feel free to get started.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, so hi everyone. Great to be here and have the opportunity to talk about Sweden and our lovely city of Stockholm. My name is Stefan Nilsson and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Swedish colocation provider Conapto. So before we go into the more specifics on Stockholm as itself, so are we changing? I would like to just remind us all that from a global perspective, we all pretty much have the same overarching goals to work against. So these are the UN Sustainability Development Goals that we all in some way needs to cater our efforts towards. And in the data center industry, in particularly, we need to take in consideration the number 7, 9, 11, 12, and 13 goals that are quite connected to what we actually do on a day-to-day business. Going into Stockholm, Stockholm is probably already from the beginning one of the most green cities in the world, but even so, we have set some bold statements in regards to the climate goals that the city of Stockholm should have. And on the screen right now is actually the general goals for Stockholm as a city. So we're aiming to be a climate positive city by 2040 actually, and there are some specific goals underneath to take us to that overarching goal at the end. So quite a lot of focus in the city on the climate and sustainability, and there are actually also a lot of work done together with the political side on collaborating towards a more sustainable city. So there are a climate pact that we as a company can be part of together with the politicians. We can then form the strategies and the goals going forward for the city's sake. So a very nice business climate from that perspective to really emphasize on the important topic. So going into sustainability, well, talking about sustainability and the data center industry, I would say that everything starts with the actual core of our business, and that's the energy that, in our case, our consumers, our customers is consuming inside the data centers. And as you can see on the screen here, Sweden is in a very, very good position on a global level. Lars will probably touch more on this in his presentation. But as you can see, the mix of hydro, nuclear, and wind actually is a very good mix compared to the overall general numbers that we have on a global level, where we still see a lot of oil and coal in the mix, which is obviously not a good thing from that perspective. So that's a good start for us to be in a situation where we actually are in a country that is already producing a lot of green energy from the beginning. That takes us to a position that's one of the greenest in Europe and one of the greenest in the world, actually, with the lowest carbon intense electricity production, as you can see here. And comparing, for example, with a few of our FLAP-D regions, for example, we are in an extremely good situation, which means that if you are a company and you are really taking your CO2 footprint very seriously and you really want to make a difference from that perspective, I would say that moving capacity or at least starting to build up new capacity in the Nordics and particularly in Sweden would be a very good thing to do. Obviously, PPAs and GEOs would take you some way down the line, but from that perspective, it's probably more good on paper than in reality from that perspective. So this is something that you should be aware of and take in consideration when doing site selections. Another good thing with Stockholm, as Anna will touch on in her presentation, is obviously the district heating network. We have one of the best built out district heating networks in the world, I think, with over 3,000 kilometers of piping. And we are feeding pretty much more than 90% of both households and companies through the district heating network. So pretty much the whole of Stockholm is connected to this. And obviously, connecting your data center to the district heating network means that you then can not only consume energy in your facility, you can also contribute with heat into the network, which means that you are not only consuming the resources, you are also giving resources back. In general, in Stockholm, you can do it in two ways. Either you have a low heat installation where you only give back the return heat, the 28, 30, 32 degree water, or you can do a high heat solution where you actually, with heat pumps, heat up the water and gives back 68, 70, or even higher, depending on where you are in the heating network, the water back to the system. And our live stats at the moment states that in the computer rooms where we actually have hooked them up to the heat pumps, we can actually reuse over 90% of the energy that we put into the computer room, which means that it's a very, very good circular economy activity to do from that perspective. Talking about collocation and talking about data center deployments, you cannot do that without talking about connectivity. And even in this case, Stockholm is in a very good position with providers like Arelion and NetNode. You will find great solutions for both internet exchange and IP transit, as well as there are a multitude of operators with POPs available. And most of the operators in Stockholm, ourselves included, have secure connections to public cloud providers, enabling our customers to really build a hybrid model where you can actually consume both private and public cloud from the same site. And this is obviously also an important aspect of things when doing site selections, the availability and the vacancy rates. And given the fact that we hear a lot of the ongoing war on available capacity in cities like Frankfurt or London or Amsterdam or Dublin, obviously looking at the north, looking at Stockholm, you will hopefully find a place where you can even find more vacant capacity from that perspective. This is actually a screenshot from a global data center market comparison that Cushman Wakefield did a few months ago, stating that Stockholm is in a very good position also on the available capacity perspective. So, to summarize, short and in brief, Stockholm could definitely be your next stop for some attractive benefits. We talked about the green energy. We talked about we're also in a position to have cheap energy comparable to a lot of other places in Europe. We have great solutions like heat reuse to district heating. Connectivity is usually sorted out in a very stable way. We have a lot of IP transit solutions, as well as the fiber network inside Stockholm is very well built out. Very low geo risk. We have a very well-educated and tech-savvy workforce, meaning that it's usually very easy to do business into Sweden, as we are a well-established country from that perspective. English is usually not an issue, even if mine maybe is not the best, but it's usually very easy to do business with us from that perspective. And last but not least, the available capacity is there for you to use from that perspective. So that's it from my side. Welcome to Sweden and welcome to Stockholm.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Appreciate your time. And your English isn't that bad. I've heard a lot worse. And it's also good to see that there's a lot of capacity in Sweden, because we definitely need it at the minute. So with that in mind, I'm going to bring Lars Schedin, who is now the senior advisor at EcoDataCenter, and he's going to continue the conversation that Stefan's had by talking about power production in Sweden and scrutinizing some of the renewable power, but specifically looking at embedded carbon emissions, because that's something that is going to become a bigger issue as we start needing to report on what we're doing. So Lars, thanks a lot. I'll hand over to you, and I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Dan, and great, Stefan. I will refer to what you have said in the past. My keynote here today is I want to discuss about renewable power, that we need to scrutinize renewable power much more than we are doing. But first of all, why moving up to Sweden? Well, first of all, we do have a very green and sustainable and very high availability to our power production. Secondly, it's possible to scale in Sweden. We are a main exporter of power today. We export more than almost 20% of our power production, 30 terawatt hours a year. So you can easily move your capacity up to Sweden and consume the power in Sweden instead of exporting it south to southern part of Europe. And furthermore, Sweden is a leading country in terms of the green transition. We are very fast in adopting new ideas in Sweden, technology as well as regulations and directives. So can we move on? Yeah. This is a statement I've heard a lot of times from colleagues in this business, less and less, but still it fluctuates, that we are climate neutral. Climate neutral data center provider because we only use renewable power, or even we are buying green certificates. Sorry guys, that is rubbish. First of all, buying green certificates will be less and less attractive as the market sees through that flaw. And secondly, there is no such thing as climate neutral power production. It has never existed, and it won't exist during my lifetime, unfortunately, because all power production comes with embedded carbons. And when people are reporting greenhouse gas protocol scope 1 and 2, well, then renewable power is zero. It's all about what's called scope 3 and all the embedded carbons when it comes to any kind of power production. And I will give you some examples. Next slide, please. I will give you one example. Hydropower. Hydropower, you have seen these plants. It contains of a lot of concrete. And when you're building these power plants, it's a lot of transportations and a lot of diesel consumed. So even though that a hydro plant in Sweden are depreciated over 100 years, it still comes with 9 grams carbon equivalents per kilowatt hours, despite that it's depreciated over 100 years, because there is so a huge amount of concrete and embedded carbons in the power plant. If we look at the next slide, we go for an example, wind power. Wind power is a completely different kind of structure in producing power, but it also comes with 12 grams of carbon emissions per kilowatt hours because it requires so much more maintenance and it's depreciated over 25 years. And someone needs to take that bill. You can't really say that it's climate neutral because it isn't. And the variety within each source of power production is huge. I will give you another example. Next slide, please. That is geothermal power. You will find geothermal. This is a picture from Iceland, but you will find geothermal power in California, Italy, Turkey, Indonesia, and that comes with a variety of emission levels. So, for example, on Iceland, the most efficient ones you will find comes with 4 grams embedded carbon per kilowatt hours. That's so far the lowest power production I've ever seen. And I can tell you, I've read a lot of scientific reports about this. And this comes from a Stanford report a couple of years ago that went through everything about geothermal power. So 4 grams, while the average on Iceland is 34 grams per kilowatt hours. But if you go down to Italy, you will find emissions up to 1,000 grams of carbons per kilowatt hour. And it all depends on the rock quality under the soil, how it is. And obviously Iceland so far has the best quality, but still it's an average of 34 grams. And if you recall Stefan's page on the averages on the emissions, that's the average. But if you are moving capacity, for instance, up from Germany up to Sweden, it's the marginal power production that should be considered. And the marginal power production in Germany is coal power, because all wind, all solar power production will be consumed. And then you are buffering everything with and balancing everything with coal power production. So moving capacity up from Germany up to Sweden, you could have as much as 98% savings in carbons, just because of you're avoiding coal power production and a higher PUE and moving it up to Sweden. If it doesn't matter if it's Stockholm or Falun. And the PUE will automatically be higher in Germany because the average temperature outside is higher in Germany, and thereby with exactly the same technical design, you will have a higher PUE also in Germany. You need to consider that. Thirdly, we also need to consider the distribution losses, because distribution losses, as Sweden is exporting a lot of power, it's the 3rd largest consumer of power in Sweden, and it is approximately 7% of the power production is lost because of distribution. So thereby moving it up to Sweden, all the data center capacity demand, and establishing yourself close to the power production, then you will have the fantastic mix of power that you will find in Sweden, and you will avoid distribution losses. Next page, please. This is a summary I made. I don't claim that it's 100% correct, but because it's changing all the time, and some of the reports are older than the others. But this is just to open the eyes for everyone that saying that renewable power, the first 4 sources here, hydro, wind, geothermal, and solar, they're all considered as renewable power. And as you can see here, hydro, the worst cases comes with 2,000 grams of emissions per kilowatt hour, and still it's considered as renewable. And how is it possible? Well, the 3rd largest country in the world producing hydropower, that is Brazil. And in Brazil, when you're building the power plants, you're drowning the rainforest, and thereby it's extremely unfriendly to the environment. So their power production comes with 2,000 grams. So this is an example, and this is trying to give insights to why we need to scrutinize what kind of renewable power are we talking about. And as you can see, hydropower then could be worse than coal power production, and geothermal could be worse than coal power production as well. So that's why we are so eager in looking into what kind of power production there is. And in Sweden, hydropower counts with 9 grams, wind power counts with 12 grams. And where we are located 250 kilometers north of Stockholm, you can get nothing else but hydro and wind. Over an average over a year, it's 75% hydro and 25% wind, with almost no distribution losses. And that's why we can actually provide such good emission reports to our customers. So the last page, please. And this is an example how we have done it in EcoDataCenter, that we're purely running on renewable power. And these numbers has been verified and assessed by external consultants. And this shows that each kilowatt hour consumed in our data center counts for 13.8 grams of emissions per kilowatt hour. And power counts for 76%. Renewable power counts for 76% of that. And now in operations, 1.7 grams, that derives from usage of diesel when we are testing the generators once a month. When we are reducing that, the power share will even increase. And that is, I know that you want me to stop now, Dan, sorry. But this is a very good example for renewable power counts with a lot of embedded carbons. And let's look into that.
Let's pick it up in the questions, because I like what you're saying. And I think the fact is people need to be looking deeper than just the power, which 100% agree. We're going to jump on to the next session because we're running quite a tight schedule today. So we're now joined by Alex Brew, who's a Regional Director of Northern Europe for Vertiv. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the integration of sustainable data center design with things like the grid and how that can progress us to the next level. Alex, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Trust you can all hear me okay. It's great to be here and it's great to be a part of the event. So I appreciate the invite. Yeah, so I'm going to take it to a slightly more granular level than some of the previous discussions that we've spoken about. But just to summarize really where we are, clearly a superior energy marketplace, which way we look at it, right? We understand that Sweden is in a very strong position in terms of its power offering to customers and the sustainable credentials associated with that. I think that the connectivity has clearly been highlighted as being very strong. So the arguments around those traditional flat markets are continuously being challenged now by the decreasing latency for connectivity into Stockholm in particular as a hub, but also other sites. And then, of course, I think what's really driving now a lot more interest into the Swedish market is that kind of heightened focus on from the public really on the understanding of data centers and their impact on the world from an energy consumption point of view, and how that interlinks into the growing agendas of large corporations and their ESG strategies, and ultimately looking to decarbonize their IT platforms. So, the Swedish market, in excess of 80% supposed renewable power generation, I should say now, having listened to the prior presentation, but obviously targeting 100% by 2040. The hyperscalers are putting a huge amount of demand on the market as things stand, and that's driven largely by some of the AI applications and HPC applications now that we're seeing start to change the nature of deployments and pose increasing challenges really on data center operators and how they're building out their estates. Wind and solar uptake we saw in the first presentation is the most rapidly increasing portion of energy contribution to the Swedish grid, but that comes with its own challenges. And heat reuse, of course, is already widely accepted and advocated, which offers tremendous opportunities for us really in terms of how we can look to use the next generation of product developments that are coming through from a critical infrastructure perspective. So I think one of the things that, from where we sit as a supplier is that we see within Sweden that how data center developers and co-location providers are positioning themselves in the market as part of a circular economy is becoming a key differentiator. And we see this, elsewhere in the Nordics, but Sweden is definitely one of the major areas, I think at the moment, probably driven by the really strong availability, where it's already kind of, they're already advocating a lot of practices around how they can integrate the waste products of data centers with utility providers and the like. And that's becoming a real competitive advantage in the marketplace, not just within the Nordics, but also at a broader level in Europe and further afield. So next slide, please. So what are we doing? There's two kind of key areas I want to focus on really from an innovation standpoint to meet with these changing market dynamics. One of them is power management, and then I will also talk about thermal management a little bit later on. But from a power standpoint, it's all about how can we leverage the assets that reside in data centers to complement and drive an increasing uptake of renewable energy, particularly. And I did notice when I was looking at the data on the prior presentation for that of wind, solar also, but wind in particular, which had the lowest spectrum in terms of grading from a carbon intensity standpoint per kilowatt produced. And wind, as Lars pointed out, is highly prevalent, certainly in the north of Sweden, but it's also one of the more easier deployment forms of renewable energy, and that's why we see considerable uptake of that as a renewable energy form in not just Sweden but other markets across Europe as well. But the problem, of course, when we bring we bring a higher dependency on these types of power generation, is that we can't control when the wind blows. We can, to a degree, of course, control when the sun is shining and not necessarily when it's cloudy, and that poses challenges on the grid. And where data centers now have a really unique opportunity is that they themselves have huge energy reserves tied up within them. Of course, there is whatever backup power generation there may be had, but there's also the UPS and the battery technologies that we host. So by design and by their very nature, data centers are highly resilient, and they have to have a level of autonomy associated with them. But for the most of a data center's life, that autonomy is in many respects a wasted resource. It's a huge charge of energy. If you were to take a data center that's tens of megawatts in size that has a 10-minute autonomy on it, that's a huge power bank reserve that sits available potentially to the grid with the right technology and design considerations being given, that can help them to balance the grid when it comes to adopting and utilizing renewables. If we jump to the next slide, I'll explain it in a little bit more detail. And really there's two types: frequency regulation and then demand management. Demand management really is quite straightforward. It's simply a case of utilizing the autonomy of a data center through an aggregator to isolate yourself from the grid during periods of peak demand. And just to contextualize that, basically, if you're a data center that's sat at 50% load, and you have an autonomy, like I said, of 10 minutes against 100% design load, that means you have an excess reserve of power where you won't necessarily be compromising on your SLAs. And if you were to able to utilize that power to isolate yourself from the grid, even for a short period of time, there are not just financial rewards that will be granted often by the utility suppliers for you doing so, but actually what you do is you'll save the grid networks from potentially having to utilize the importing from elsewhere, switching onto alternative means of energy supply, which perhaps are more carbon intensive, and effectively utilizing a higher portion of renewables as a result. And what you can also do is you can charge or recharge the battery store that exists within your data center during times that more renewable sources are contributing to the grid, when the energy itself should also be cheaper and, of course, less carbon intensive. And then the other one is frequency regulation. Because of the nature of how these particularly wind are contributing power to the grid, there can be an imbalance in terms of where the supply is being delivered from. And fundamentally, you can use, without going into too much detail, the data center and the battery storage or energy storage associated with the critical power train to offset that over periods of time to help regulate the frequency on the grid. So it's kind of looking again a little bit like the theme of implementing district heating systems with data centers and the waste product of heat is one that's kind of very, very, very highly recognized, I suppose, within the Swedish marketplace. And this is kind of replicating that same circular economy type effect, but also on the power side. It's decarbonizing, or helps to take steps to decarbonize the grid. Can, of course, generate new revenue streams for co-locators, allowing them to potentially be more competitive within the marketplace. Can improve operational resilience by helping to stabilize the grid with that frequency regulation, and of course alleviating any grid supply constraints, which we know in this case is a bit less of an issue with Sweden, but still. Next slide, please. From a thermal management point of view, and thermal management is a term we utilize for the full portfolio of cooling products that we do, but the biggest disruptor that's coming over the hill now is liquid cooling. It is here, it's certainly arrived. I think the market and a number of colo operators are very much kind of waiting to see in what form it's going to take en masse. There's a number of different solutions that exist and that are available, but it's fundamentally being driven by higher density IT compute. And a lot of that is associated with trends around AI, high performance computing, as I talked about. And of course, a lot of the server manufacturers now are increasing the power and the speed at which their hardware is operating, and recognizing that liquid cooling is the answer to facilitate that from a heat rejection and temperature management standpoint. There's no two ways about it. Everybody knows that liquids are, or in most instances, are better conductors of heat than air, and therefore they're a far more efficient mechanism for transferring away heat from the IT equipment, which is one of the principal purposes of a data center when it comes to safeguarding the environment that the information is, the IT platform is housed in. And of course, it's really important to have a flexible portfolio to cater for all the different sizes, shapes of IT infrastructure, which could potentially utilize that liquid cooling platform. And really, traditionally, we've had a lot of what we would call rear door air-based systems. And now what's coming forward is that rack densities are moving up from 50 kilowatts towards the 100, 200 kilowatt range. And that's driving the need now to have mass adoption of liquid cooling across the estate. I'll just quickly flip onto the next slide, Dan, and then I will wrap up. So really, I think the most critical thing with the adoption of liquid cooling is the introduction of what we call bridge products. Products that there is a huge existing estate of data centers, which aren't necessarily liquid cooling ready for, you know, a fully dedicated suite of some of the products that are kind of most widely recognized now. So what we've been working on alongside those is to bring products to the market that can enable people to install liquid cooling platforms in traditional white space architecture, to help the kind of initial steps into adopting the technology, people realizing the benefits and moving forward. And just finally, the obvious big play, particularly in Sweden with the district heating systems, is that of course it operates at far higher temperatures, which means that the temperatures that you can then reuse as part of your district heating system, which Anna is going to talk about in a lot more detail than me, will potentially be of higher quality, shall we say, and for broader applications, and require less energy to cycle it up to the temperatures that it makes use of. I won't run through the conclusion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And we can cover some of this in the questions a bit later on. So our last short presentation is from Anna Bloomborg, who is with Alfa Laval, and we're going to be looking at heat reuse matchmaking. So I'm going to hand over to Anna, and we'll get started straight away, and then we'll come into questions. Thanks a lot, Anna. Anna, we can't hear you. Anna. It's those headphones.
Now, you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. That's great.
Okay. Okay, sorry for that. It's those headphones. I knew it. Okay. So, talking about heat reuse, Sweden and the Nordic countries are in the forefront of recovering heat from data centers, but I would argue that it's not completely without challenges. So we'll talk about that. I think this presentation can serve as an inspiration to all of you also outside Sweden. And in the end, I'll end with a call to action, because there are things to do if we really want to capture these opportunities. Just one slide to show you what Alfa Laval is doing in the world of data centers. We are not building data centers. We're not operating data centers. We supply highly efficient heat transfer solutions for cooling and heat reuse. So that is where we come in. Heat reuse from data centers. We heard Stefan talk about more than 90% of the energy could be recovered. Theoretically, almost 100% of the energy used in a data center, it's converted to heat energy that could be recovered. And of course, we want to recover heat as high temperatures as possible, but it should be okay to use them even at a lower grade, because we can put in heat pumps to elevate the temperatures. And it's so common to say that to connect the waste heat opportunities to district heating. And typically people outside Sweden will say, well, it's easy for Sweden and the Nordics. They have all these district heating infrastructure. That's easy to recover heat. But we are testing, we're trying, and there is so much more than district heating to do when it comes to use as heat hosts. And I mean, ideally, you would look for heat hosts that has a need for your heat 24/7. And we could look at water preheat, industrial laundries, bioethanol production, food and beverage, and you see the list here of hosts that could use a data center heat 24/7. Then when you look at district heating, yes, the opportunity and the possibility for a district heating network to take loads of waste heat is of course a big plus, but there are seasonal variations. During the summers, when you don't need to use so much heat for your space heating, it's mainly tap water. Then we call it a heat host with seasonal variation, and there are other hosts we are trying now as to use for greenhouses or biomass drying or fish farming. Great opportunities, but they have a seasonal variation. The drivers and enablers for why we see more and more heat reuse schemes, yes, we have the need to decarbonize the world. And we want to electrify the world. And how can we electrify the world? We cannot do it without utilizing all the amounts of waste heat that is available in the world. And we see governments putting in place new legislation and subsidies to drive this. We also see the IT sector, setting up very ambitious sustainability goals. And heat reuse is an enabler for a data center operator to claim they are more sustainable, right? We see the price of fossil fuel that improves the economics of a data center heat reuse scheme, and that is also enabling. And as Alex mentioned in his presentation, a greater adoption of the new direct liquid cooling technologies gives higher return temperatures. We see the traditional to the left air-cooled server technology below 30 degrees, while we move into immersion cold plate cooling or immersion cooling, where we are getting up to 55, maybe 60, maybe in the dream 65 degrees. And you understand the higher, when you start seeing above 50 degrees, then you can really use these temperatures directly without the need to transform them. I want to highlight a super initiative driven by the Open Compute Project, OCP, in their US working group on heat reuse. They are putting together a project map, a map of all existing heat reuse projects and projects under development. And here you see very clearly the focus in Europe and North Europe. And this is to be populated as we move along. There is currently like 70 projects or something like that. And what makes heat reuse possible, and not only possible, but sustainable? Well, we need collaboration. We need a heat host nearby the data center, either as a direct consumer or a utility. If the distances are too far, it will be huge investments in infrastructure, and it will be. So a heat host nearby is of course preferred, and a temperature that is interesting for the heat host. As I said, you can do it with heat pumps, but if you can do it without, even better. You need collaboration between different entities, and you need a legislative structure that encourages this collaboration. What you see in this picture is kind of a dream picture of a sustainable city where all industries come together. You have a data center as number 3 in the middle, a heat plant that yes, requires energy, but can also give back. And we need to set up this collaboration and couple sectors together. And for that, we also need a legislative structure that can enable this. Going back again to the Open Compute Project, they just released a white paper on heat reuse. If you and they have a heat reuse working group. It's run by Cosimo Pecchioli from Alfa Laval, based in US, and Jaime Comella, based in Spain. It's not a US group, it's a global, international community. So don't get fooled about OCP in US. They run a fantastic work group on heat reuse, open for everyone. You get to it by the QR code. And they put together a white paper on how to capture global opportunities for heat reuse. Contributors were Rolf Brink, David G. from Implion, NREL researchers, and a university professor as well. So I encourage you to check this out. And ending with a call for action, we need to get together to even strengthen the opportunities in Sweden and the Nordic countries when it comes to heat reuse, but also to add it on a global scale. So go in, join the OCP heat reuse group. It's for free, open for anyone. And OCP is now talking about bringing together relevant stakeholders, data center owners, heat users, utility companies, and authorities for a roundtable discussion. You can call it a heat reuse matchmaking session. And I would be super honored to host a roundtable in Sweden if anyone is interested. So just get back to me. But I think there is huge opportunities to capture, but we need to do them together, and we need to collaborate all relevant stakeholders. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you to all of our panelists and for everyone who's listening for taking the time. And we've got a few questions. So if there is any questions, please just stick them in the chat and I will try and ask them. But I think I'm a big believer in context and trying to contextualize where we are, right? Because you're all living this every day. But I think, and I'm not going to follow any of the questions that you were sent, just so you're aware, because my mind has been buzzing full of various different things. But Anna, what are you seeing this like? I mean, I know that there's legislation that we're seeing in places like the Netherlands, where all new data centers have to have an ability to have an heat off-taker. You know, that's the type of stuff that I think we're going to get coming around. But what level of heat reuse are you seeing in the projects that you're working on? Is it 1 in 10? Is it 1 in 20? Is it like, you know, how far away are we from mass kind of adoption of this?
Yeah, I don't want to be so bold and put up the figure, because you see Eco, you see Vertiv, you see Conapto. We do have many heat reuse schemes, and many of them are up and running and working. But I know Stefan and we talked about also the fact that, yes, you can have a data center project that is ready for heat reuse, but still the business model is lacking. So that is why I say we need to get these stakeholders together to really get set up the business model. It needs to be feasible for a data center to provide heat. Who is going to pay for the infrastructure investments? Who gets to take credit for the carbon emissions being saved and so forth? So what it really, yeah.
Oh no, I get you. I'm just wondering whether you're seeing it kind of, I mean, because let's take it, if you look at it from the other perspective, when you look at RFPs, and maybe Lars or Stefan can come into this question. When you're looking at co-location RFPs from like hyperscale customers, there's more and more, there's an ESG aspect to it, right? So there's a sustainability aspect as part of that RFP. I would imagine, I'm not in the business in the same way you are, but I'm assuming Lars and Stefan, it's what, all of them, 100% of the RFPs that you're getting have got an ESG aspect to it?
No, not really. But when it comes to hyperscalers, I would say that they are in the front line right now, which is good because they need to drive the changes. But when it comes to RFPs from customers from France and Germany, it's not necessarily on top 3 really on their agenda yet, which is strange. I still think that it's very much focused on cost and time to market, speed.
So, but as we move through the legislative framework that's coming in and it's getting more onerous with the CSRD that's happening, you can imagine that it's going to become more of a prerequisite.
It will. It will.
And you'd like to think that as part of that, heat reuse is going to become, you know, having a realistic option for heat reuse is going to have to become something that, you know, data centers are going to have to consider. A bit like what Alex was saying in terms of grid integration and working outside of the scope of the data center, you know, working with other third parties as part of this construction. I heard about a data center operator that is looking at getting into heat reuse projects as part of their kind of development projects. I've come across containerized solutions that you can now co-locate in the curtilage of data centers with kind of agricultural related stuff. So are we just, you know, if we kind of forward glaze into 5 years time, we're in 2028, you know, and given that we don't have a huge amount of time, is it going to be the norm, Anna, do you think, or is it, how long is it going to take us to get to the point where it's the norm from a heat reuse perspective?
It's going to be a prerequisite for participating in new RFPs. It will. But as Anna commented, it's very important also how you are viewing the avoided emissions, because currently when we are reusing the heat with heat pumps, we are penalized because we will carry on cost and emissions for the power used, while we are not allowed, according to greenhouse gas protocol, to include the benefits. So we have to take a full scope approach on
I'm going to come back to you on that, Lars. Just let me. I'm going to come back to that. Let's just let Anna just quickly answer that.
I think we what's also going to drive heat reuse is not only the data center and the community itself. It's also everything around decarbonizing the world and doing it in sustainable cities. So we already have cities all over Europe with super high demands to identify possible heat sources, and data centers are really lucrative. I mean, they're really looking at what kind of data centers do I have in my city, around my city, to use as heat hosts? And that's being driven. We see data centers coming into the city planning as we come on. So it's not only the data center industry itself that's going to push for heat reuse. We see it now coming from the cities and the municipalities all over Europe.
So following that through, Alex, you talked about a couple of things I just wanted to pick up quickly on the immersive cooling, liquid cooling, and grid integration. Again, contextualize it for me, please. Are we talking about like 1 in 10? How if you forward gaze a few years, how much of a norm is both of those two things going to be in the next 5 years?
I think liquid cooling, we will see a really significant portion of new deployments year over year. It will become a higher percentage of new deployments that are rolling through. And I think that will be driven by the hyperscalers. There's a caveat on exactly when we start to see that mass deployment coming through from them, but it's entirely evident that they will need that sort of platform to drive, you know, the process intensity of the new sort of AI programs that are being rolled out and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't want to quote you an exact figure, but it's certainly going to increase. And I think that by the time, 5 years time, we expect it to be the norm. It's not that it's going to replace air cooling. We have a colossal amount of existing air cooling data centers that will continue to operate. And I think we're going to have a number of sites that will have to have a mix. And that's why it's quite important for us to be able to make sure that we've got, the two technology platforms that can complement one another.
Hang on a second. I'll come back to you, Stefan, in 1 second. So, Alex, sorry to interrupt. And then the second question: what about on the grid integration? So,
we're seeing a stronger uptake. I think that the stability of the grid supply in Sweden means that it's if you look at the business case for doing it, some of it is more around the financial rewards that can be recompensed for doing so. But also that ESG agenda differentiator in terms of bolstering the profile of trying to offset and feed back into the grid for players that are competing within the marketplace. And I think that what's happening now is traditionally, and we've got to remember that some of this technology has actually been available for quite a few years now, but it's been very difficult for the market to be prepared to accept it. because why would I want my data center to, to be, even if I'm being hosted by co-locators, I don't want that co-locator playing around with the grid, passing power back to them. That sounds to me a little bit risky. Whereas, people's thought processes around what that means as a mechanism to move towards a more sustainable future have evolved a lot, which now means that clients and, often the hyperscalers, but other people are looking to data centers now to have those types of initiatives in place. And that's a key step change we've seen in the last few years.
So Stefan, you had your hand up and I've got a question for you. So you go first and then I'll ask you my question.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit, but on the liquid cooling stuff, for example, I'm not really sure I'm agreeing with you, Alex, on that one. I know you're a technology vendor, so by the way, I think that we still are a long way before especially the bigger international customers that has already standardized on a lot of equipment. They even buy OEM servers, and they have maybe put orders for servers for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of the curve. So I think talking to a lot of them, I think they're still very much into the old traditional way of doing things. I think they have invested a lot of money into the technology and the knowledge behind building compute nodes in air-cooled environments. We can still cope with 10, 15, maybe 20 kilowatt per rack, so we can go quite high on the air side. So I think we're still a bit away from the liquid cooling stuff. The further south you go in Europe, I think it will be more crucial to actually deploy it.
I mean, if you look at the design temperatures that we've designed up to from an ASHRAE standard perspective, historically we've designed up to, I think, 35 degrees. In the UK, we're now hitting 40 degrees, 44 degrees or something like that last year. So I think the design criteria for data centers is changing. The feedback that we're getting from the market is that in terms of large scale adoption, there is a process, right? That you go from kind of air cooled to rear door heat exchangers to direct to chip to immersive cooling. Lots of that's going to be driven by the changes in the density of the chipsets. And, you are forecasting that the rack densities are going to increase significantly up to well above 40 kilowatts per rack by about 2028, and then up to 60 kilowatts per rack by 2031. So at that point, it's feeling like there is going to be a shift. But I would also agree, Stefan, that shift hasn't fully happened yet. But the AI requirements that we're seeing in the market at the minute, I was speaking to one vendor who was a hyperscale operator, and they were forecasting that they're going to have 7 times their current server footprint with AI within the next few years. I'm getting 5 times total power consumption by another hyperscale operator. So the amount of AI workloads that are coming through, which are predominantly a much higher heat chipset, are quite significant. But what I was going to ask you, Stefan, is in terms of Sweden and the move away from the flat markets, right? The move away from and Lars, you can answer as well. But is Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Finland, are you going to become a primary data center market, or do you feel that you're still going to be more of and I don't mean this in any disrespect, but more of a green hard drive for Europe? Do you feel like that there's going to be a point in the next few years where you're going to be at the same sort of level of consumption on a megawatt basis as some of these more primary markets?
To be honest, the sad answer is that we will probably never get in line with Frankfurt or London or those areas. To be honest, I think they're far ahead, and still you see a lot of growth there. You see that they grow even faster than we are, annoyingly, to be honest. But hopefully, along both regulation and compliance perspective, but also companies really emphasizing on the fact that, okay, we really need to do some serious stuff when it comes to sustainability, then we hopefully will see a shift from deploying capacity in less greener areas and move, or at least start to build new capacity in greener areas as well, to lower the carbon footprint. Because to be honest, that's the only way of doing it. Buying
let me stop you there, because I know Lars has seen this, right? So Lars, you've been seeing that movement, haven't you? So how much? Is that tap dripping still, or is it?
No. It's open cranes right now, and we are focusing very much on high performance computing, as Alex touched upon. And talking to colleagues in Central Europe, their comments is that they feel more or less disqualified from this market segment, as this is less latency dependent, and they will go into low cost and sustainable solution. And low cost is very much related to low power price. And thereby Norway, Finland, and in particular Sweden are best qualified in capturing this demand in AI and deep learning, machine learning. So I think that it is happening. I don't totally agree with Stefan. I think that we will have a tipping point in where liquid cooling very soon will increase rapidly. We have been talking about it. The industry has been talking about it for many years. But it's now when AI is growing by some 30-35% a year in growth, and this, as you said, the density per rack will increase and will require liquid cooling very soon. We have liquid cooling solutions installed up in Follow.
So just to summarize, I know we're just over time by 1 minute. So, it strikes me that the demand is not ceasing, right? A significant amount of that demand is now going to be coming from more AI-based workloads over the coming years. And those AI workloads could see a good home in Sweden, Scandinavia, with liquid cooling, with some form of heat reuse. So hopefully we do this talk again in maybe next year or the year after, and we can talk about some of those case studies that you guys have been working on. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the audience for turning up. This will be screened on Digital Infrastructure Network. It's the first of our live LinkedIn live talks, and we're excited to do some more of them, and hopefully you've got some learnings from it. Connect to our esteemed panel via LinkedIn, and if you have any questions, then just let us know directly. So with that, I will end the broadcast. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.